Hello, everybody, and welcome to the InduSoft webinar, Stump the Expert. So my name is Paulo Guerra, and I work with the consulting services teams here at InduSoft, and I'll be participating, answering your questions today on this webinar. So first of all, I'd like to thank you, thank each one of you for participating on this webinar, but also for continue to use our products and services. It's really just because of our customer, clients, partners that we are able to continue growing our business, evolving our business, but also keep releasing and evolving our products. So this is the last webinar for 2016. We will continue with the series on beginning of 2017. 2016 was a very important year for us. We had big releases for our product, including our Service Pack 1 for InduSoft Web Studio version 8.0. This release, we brought major new features to the product, such as start supporting the trend control on our estimating client, support for database functions on our IoT View product, so pretty much our Linux runtime version, so our runtime version for Linux environments. A completely new find and replace tool. So for those of you who are used to dealing with big projects, that's definitely a big help for us when trying to search and replace portions of the code on your application. Support for custom widgets and many more. Again, I just wanted to take the time. All of these releases for the past 15 years. It's really only possible because of you, because of the support of our customers, our partners. So I'd like to thank you, all of you, and also wish a very successful 2017 for all of you guys. As probably many of you know, today we don't have a specific agenda. The idea with this webinar series is really for our customers, our partners, to send questions, ask questions during the webinar, and I'll try to answer those, as well as if it requires coding and configuring, I'll try to show exactly how you can do that specific functionality, that specific problem, how to solve that specific problem or issue that you might be having there. We already received a couple questions here, so I'll start by those, but feel free throughout the webinar. You can use the WebEx control. So if you go to the top of your screen, you have here on top the chat interface. You can open and you can type there your questions, any question you might have, and I'll try to answer all of those if possible. Okay, so again, the idea should be more a Q&A section here. So let's start here. The first one that I had, we received previously and came, so I need to create a graphic where each dot or each data saved depends on another tag or another trigger, not based on time. The idea is that the application that this customer is trying to build, it has to register one data point every time they wait a specific part of the process, so they don't just want to save that specific data point at that time. So what I'm going to do here, I'm going to go to InduSoft Web Studio, and actually I'm going to create a new project here. So let's put Stump the Expert 2016. And so I'm starting a project from the scratch. And again, the idea with this question from this customer, rather than saving a data point using our trend control, our trend task, every X amount of time, every second, every minute, or every hour, he wants only to save that point whenever there is a change, whenever there is a trigger. So for that, we can use a specific trigger. So how would we do that? We would go to our tasks portion here, our task tab. Under the trend, we can insert a new trend control. So I'm going to say here, save data points. I'm going to use a database here, just so we can see, which is easier. So let's go, actually, I'm going to open my Management Studio real quick here. And I do see I'm receiving some additional questions, so as soon as we are done with that one, we'll go to additional ones. So while it's opening, let's wait for that. But pretty much, let's create a tag. So let's say my variable. That's the tag that I want to save. So I'm going to call that a real, for example. And by default, every time you insert a trend sheet, you have this save on trigger, and it's configured to use the tag seconds. But on this specific case, the customer does not want to save every second. He only wants to save that tag based on a trigger. So what I'm going to do here, let's create another tag called my trigger, for example, and that can be an integer. So let's go to database here real quick. So I'm opening SQL Management Studio. As you probably, many of you know, on InduSoft, you can choose to save data to proprietary file formats, so pretty much binary files. Any relational database, in this case, you'll be using the SQL Management Studio, a SQL Server Express version here, or Wonder Online. So what I'm going to do here is just create a new database, and I'm going to call that my data, for example. And we should see, there you go. So we have this new database. We still do not have any tables created, but we don't need to do any of that because InduSoft will take care of that. So the first thing we're going to do is come back to the project here. I'm going to configure a default database. So I'm just going to say my default database here. It's going to use a SQL Server. I'm using a Express version, so I'm going to use my SQL Express running locally. I'm going to use Windows security, integrated security, and I'm going to look for my database. I can test my connection, and I'm connected to the database. So if I say OK, so now I have my default database connection created, which means I can come here and just say use my project default, and it's there. I'm going to leave the database, the table name as trend001, and I'm going to let it automatically create it. So if I put that here, if I save, so now my task is ready to start saving. So now let's create a screen here real quick for us to start seeing this data. So I'm going to put a text box here where I can put my variable, so I can simulate my variable values. And as we discussed on this customer-specific case, every time there is a data point, every time there is a new measurement, we would receive a trigger to save that data point. So what I can do, I'm just going to use a screen script here, and I'm going to write a very basic code here to every time that my variable changes to cause a trigger to save that data to the database. I'm going to do my last variable, so I'm just creating here a VB script variable to compare with my variable, and every time this is different, I know, okay, I need to take some action. But as soon as I know that, I can already put them to be the same, so this way I'm not executing this code over and over and over. I just want to execute one time for each time my variable change, and I'm going to do here a toggle of my variable. Okay, so I'm going to save that, actually my trigger here. Okay, there we go. So if we save that, I'm just going to save as is for now. I'm going to put in here my startup screen. I'm going to set this as my startup screen. If I run my project now, so my variable is 0. If I go to 50, if I go to 75, so now if we go to the database and I refresh my tables here, InduSoft automatically creates the table for us. And if I look for the records I already have on that table, we should have 2 records now, so 50 and 75. Okay, so now how can I display this data on the screen here? So I'm going to insert a trend control. Here under my points, I'm going to say my variable. Okay. Here, let's start this way. If I do this, you see that the trend is automatically updating every second, and as I'm changing my variable, it will show the trend. But again, this is automatically moving based on a time interval here. So we have a couple options here. The first option would be to say, okay, I do not want to update my trigger. So under the advanced settings on the trend control, I do not want to update my trigger automatically based on my second tag. I actually want to update that based on my trigger. So that only when there's a new data point, I want to move my trend. So if I do 35, there it goes. If I do 75, there it goes. So it works, but there is still one very important aspect here, is that although we are not saving the data every second, we are really only saving on a trigger every time this variable changes, I am still saving that based on a timestamp. So, which means the data points are not uniquely divided during an interval. And maybe that's what this customer wants. So he might be wanting to actually save that data point based on what we call a XY trend. Rather than saving on a time-based trend, they want to save on a XY trend. So we can do that. And real quick here, so if we go to the trend again, I'm going to still use my trend task here to save the data. I could be using VB script functions or our built-in database functions to save this data into a table which is not based on time. But just for this matter of example, I'm going to still use the trend control, and I'm going to create here another variable called my sample ID. So it's going to be an integer, and the idea with this tag is every time I have a new data point, I'm going to increment this number, so that later I can build a graphic based on my sample ID on the x-axis and my variable on the y-axis. So if I come here, let's go back to my script. So what I want to do now, every time there's a new data point, I want to also increase my sample ID +1. Okay? So now if we save that, and I come here and I do 45, then I do 65, and we go to the database. Now we have a new column called my sample ID, and for each sample I have a unique identifier. And now the idea is that rather than using a trend control where I'm using the timestamp and the my variable column, I'm going to use the my sample ID and my variable column to build my chart. So how do we do that? So I'm going to come here, I'm going to make another copy of this object. I'm going to scroll down. And now, rather than having, as I said, a date-time-based type of graph, I'm going to use a numeric type of graph. It gives you a warning saying that your current configuration for the points does not align with this type of graphic. And that's because when you are using this type of graph, you need to create what we call a data source. You cannot use a tag data source as we used here. When you're using a tag data source, InduSoft automatically knows, okay, this my variable is being saved based on the trend one, so it knows how to go back to the history and pull that data. When you're using an XY, we need additional information, and because of that, we need to create a data source. So what I'm going to do here, I'm going to create a new data source. I'm going to create my data source. On this case, again, I'm using a database, but I could be using different types. I could be using Access file, a Notepad file, a text file, other types of databases. So here you have to configure what is your x-axis field. So if I go back to my database, my x-axis field is my column, my sample ID. So I'm going to come back here. I'm going to say my sample ID. Under advanced settings, I'm still going to use the same connection, my default connection, but my table here, now it's actually trend 001. So that's the table that we created, that InduSoft created. But again, you could be using any table, existing table, tables created through scripting, any relational table. Then here, I'm going to come and I'm going to disable the move current time on run. Now I do not want not time-based anymore. And if I go back here, if I do 75, and then if I do 30, oops, sorry, I forgot to. Under my point, I need to configure my data source. So that's the data source we created. So if I click here, okay, maybe I cancel. So let's just create again my data source. And I say create database, my sample ID. Say okay. Here, trend 001. Okay. Okay. Now I come here. There you go. So now I have my data source. And now my fields, what is the name of my column that represents my X or X? On this case is my variable. So I'm going to come here. My variable. I go to advanced, move current time on run. Sorry, I think what I did the other time was actually I make change on my time-based one that I was expecting to do on the other ones. I'm just checking some configuration here. Now if I go back here, I can come here and I say I have a new point. Then I have a new point. So now my trend control is based on an interval. So here it's 0 to 3, but let's say I can come here and I can define my interval. So let's say you know it's always 10 data points that you are looking for on this specific variable. So what you could do here, you could come here and say, okay, trend mean equals, you can say, my sample minus 10. And then trend max equals my sample. So pretty much, let's say create that, create that as well. Then if I come here, trend mean here and trend max here. So this way you're always looking for the last 10 samples on this case, for example. So there you go. And now if I do 15, you have the new data point. If I do 35, you have the new data point, and so on and so forth. So again, different ways to accomplish. So pretty much you are doing, you are either storing based on a timestamp or store based on a trigger, but still looking based on a time interval, or you can store based on a trigger, but also visualize the data on a more XY type of graphic. Like if you want to do force by pressure, for example, it's very used. Different types of graphics and measurements where you might want to do that not based on a timestamp series, but actually on a secondary variable or on a simple identifier like we are doing here, where I have just a unique identifier, incremental identifier that every sample I add a new point to my database. Okay, so now let me take a look here. I have some additional questions here. So, okay, so I think actually a question here is similar to what we were doing or related to what we were doing, and they were asking about the label column here. How do they display to get the name from the database. So let me just make sure I got the correct. How to get the name for the label from the same database. Okay, so if I'm understanding correct, what he's trying to do is actually have this, rather than having something hard-coded here, actually have a variable, InduSoft tag, for example, where based on that tag, he would know the name of the variable that he wants to look for. So what we can do here is, let's create another tag here called maybe pointer or variable name. So I'm going to create that as a name, as a string. Local, because most likely that will depend on the client. And then here, oops, not here, but actually here, I want to say that's going to be my variable name. So if I come here, I do variable name, and now in variable name, I put my variable. So pretty much I'm passing the name of my column or my tab based on a tag name. So if I do here, you see it's not there. What you need to do in this case, you need to reload your data source. So if you come here, we have this reload field. So I can call reload, or just following the same, my reload. Yes. And I'm going to say integer is fine. And then on this case, I'm just going to put a button here on the screen where I can say my reload equals table my reload. In your case, most likely on your logic where you are setting the name of this variable based on a selection from the user, that's where you would be reloading that data source and getting that information from. Still not working. Let me check here. Oops. I lost here. Okay. Okay, still not working. Let's add here the database message so we can troubleshoot that. If I do reload, okay, invalid column. Oh, sorry. Here it's going to be variable name. Okay, there you go. So now we have here variable name. And so if you do another example, quick example here, if I come back to my trend, I can call and not create another variable. Let's maybe do a variable 2. I'm going to create this tag as a real here as well. I'm going to save that. Just going to duplicate this to have my variable 2. Okay. Maybe now what we can do here is actually have two buttons. One where I set, so I'm going to set variable name equals my variable on this one and reload my logic. On the second one here, very similar, but I'm going to set my variable 2. If I save that, so let's create a couple points here. So far my logic I need to trigger my first tag in order for cause the trend to save. So that's why I'm changing both here. Okay. With that should be already be enough. There we go. So now as I'm clicking here, I can change dynamically what tag I'm looking for. So as you see here, right now we are looking at my variable 2. If you look at the database spy here, the variable tag is pointing to my variable 2 column. So again, if you come here, now I have a my variable 2 column, which has null for the beginning because I wasn't saving the data. So as you see here on the screen, we have null for about half of the trend. But if I come and I go back to my first one, then I have data. Here I don't have data, and so on and so forth. Okay, does that, so pretty much to answer, I think your question was about, so what you want to do is use the curly braces. So the trick here is to use a data source, as you said you're already using, but use curly braces using your InduSoft string tag name to change that automatically, to get the value of that column that you want. Okay, let me see here if we have additional questions. Okay, good question here. So another question asks, is it possible to run 2 or more instances of IWS at the same time? Would be very useful to get things from older projects into new projects. Okay, you cannot run 2 versions of the runtime at the same time, but if you do have different versions of the project, so for example, right now I'm using here version 8.0. So if you come here to the help about, I'm using version 8.0 Service Pack 1, and I can open here my version 7.1 in parallel. So here, so now I have my 7.1, and then as you said, you can open projects and copy from the older version developed on 7.1 to the 8.0 project. But again, you cannot, the limitation is really about what you cannot do is try to run 2 runtimes at the same time. That the machine will not allow you to do that. Okay. So I have another question here. The lines were not connected. Okay. Okay, so a good question. So I think there was one customer here that was seeing this scenario that we are building here, and he mentioned, okay, so sometimes on this case, the data points will take, or the difference between one data point and the next data point, the change on variable, will take a long time to happen. And I think it's more about this first scenario here on top. And on this case, sometimes they do not want to join the 2 different data points if there's a specific interval. So if it's a greater than a specific interval, it does not want to join 2 data points and assume that was the shape of the curve. So what you can do on this case, you can come here on InduSoft, under the points, you can go to options, and we have what we call break interval. So pretty much this tells InduSoft, okay, if there's 2 points that are far apart, more than 7,200 points seconds, I do not want you to join these 2 points together, to draw a line between these 2 points. So if you need to be very small, you can decrease this number to whatever interval you need, greater than an hour, greater than 1 minute, and then InduSoft will not join those 2 points together. Okay? Okay, so let's see next question here. You write a syntax to a label field to read the temp name. Can you write a syntax to a label field? Yes, okay. So maybe what I'm assuming is that he wants also here under the label, he also wants to have something dynamically rather than having something hard-coded like pressure here. He wants to have something dynamically. Yes, you can. The same concept of, so we come back to this one, same idea, you can put in something like a tag, so my description, and InduSoft automatically recognizes because you're using the curly brackets, so it's saying, okay, you need to create, that tag does not exist, local. Then if I come back here, again, the same idea, let's say, description equals, let's say this one is pressure, and let's say this one here is voltage. If we save again, oops, let's add the description here. Oh, we already have label there, right? So there you go. So now we have pressure, now we have voltage, pressure here under the label field. You can very easily change that dynamically as well. So pretty much normally what you would have is an interface where the user have a small dialog where they can select all the variables. You go to the database, you get all the information, units, labels, things like that. You set the tags that you're using on your trend control, like we are using on this example here. So you could use the same to do the units, for example, here, and then that would change dynamically during the runtime. Okay, let's see if we have any additional questions here. Okay, so we have one question here, how to use the go-to syntax in a math worksheet. Okay, so if you come here, so pretty much I can go to my InduSoft, can go back to my tasks, I can right-click on my math, insert a new math worksheet. I can put here, this is an example, and here I can say execute trigger. So it recognizes that does not exist. I say OK. So the way our math worksheet works, whenever you have whatever you have on this execution field, which is true, is greater than 0, it will execute this worksheet from the top to the bottom. So the idea with the go to is a way for you to be able to move from one line straight to different lines depending on a condition. So for example, let's say you have a condition, you have a scenario where you need to increase a tag from 1 to 100, one value, 1 unit at a time, and once it gets to 100, stop executing this script, for example. So what you could do here is say, okay, I'm going to create here a label, a portion of my code, which I'm calling A, for example. Then I'm going to say here, okay, my tag A, which does not, oh, even better, let's use my variable so we can play with that. I'm going to say, okay, every time this line of code is executed, I want to increase this tag by 1, for example. So every time it goes through this line of code, it's going to add 1 and puts back into my variable. And now I can use the go-to syntax, oops, no space, go-to say, for example, a condition. If my variable is smaller than 100, I want it to go to section A of my code. You see on the top, on the first line, we call that portion A. If not, I want it to go to portion B. So then here I can say my label, that's portion B of my code. And then I say, okay, if it gets to this point, I want to put my execute trigger back to 0. So in other words, we're going to keep executing this math until my variables get to 100. As soon as it gets to 100, it's going to stop executing that. So if I save that, and if I come here, I can log so we can see it because the math interface is very fast, so if you just look at my variable here, we will not be able to see all the chains, but it's on 10 right now. I come here and I set my execute trigger to 1. Okay. My variable. Log my variable. Okay. So my variable go to, if my variable is less than 100, go to A. If not, goes to B. Label. Okay. Something wrong here on my syntax. Label B, trigger 0. Oh. There you go. So, sorry, I wasn't. Here's the expression, so I just need to say if execute trigger equals 1, and as soon as I changed that, so it executed from, it was on 10 previously, so it added 1 data point all the way to 100, and then it stopped. So now if I put 0 again, and I say execute again, there it goes, 0 to 100, and it stops. So it's just a way, using the go-to, you're able to create almost like functions on scripting where you can call specific parts similar to that. So you can say go to this area of the code, so it skips back to that portion of the code. Okay, so that was one about the go-to interface under the math script. Let me see what else do I have here. Okay, how can I easily do a file save as for the whole project so I can save it under a different name? Okay, good question. So as you said there, if you have a file here, you can very easily come here and say save as and rename that file, that specific file, to another name. If you need to rename your entire project, you don't need to do any of that. All you need to do is just change the project file name. So if I go to the project explorer here, for example, I have the PC demo, I can very easily copy that. And then you can just rename the folder and the app file to whatever name you want. And you have a copy of that project. So there's a big project. So it's going to take here a while. There it goes. So now I can come here and call PC demo 1. And I can go inside my project and I can come here and say PC demo 1 as well. And there you go. And you already renamed your whole project, so you do not need to do a special save as. You can just copy your folder, rename the app file, and you are done. Okay, let's see another question here. So okay, so it's one question regarding communication. So pretty much he's saying, okay, how do we support control, to have more control over our communication when using a driver? So for example, Modbus. So he's saying that he has a low-cost device and that he does not want to keep pulling the data every time. So he wants to have a little bit more control and he wants to read specific block sizes. So very good question. Yeah, we do support that. So if you go to InduSoft here, so under InduSoft, under our project here, we have our Con tab, and you have drivers. So you can very easily come and add a new driver. So on this, let's use this example, Modbus or Modbus TCP. You can select, so you add that driver to your project, and now you have here. Now, when you expand that driver folder here on your project, by default, or at least on most of the case, 95% of the drivers, you're going to have what we call the main driver sheet. And the main driver sheet is a sheet, a very easy interface where you just put your tag name, your station, the IO address, and if you want to, what is the action, if you want to enable read and write, or read only, write only, or read and write, and you have the scan option. So you can say, I want to scan all the time. I want to scan only when this tag, this specific tag here, so again, that example, my variable, so only when that tag is being displayed on any screen, either the local viewer or any client, anything client. Or you can say auto, and InduSoft, you look, for example, if your tag is only being used on a screen, it will automatically switch this internally to screen. If you are using this tag on a alarm or trend sheet, InduSoft recognize no, because he wants to generate an alarm, we need to keep pulling this tag all the time. So it will automatically set that always. So you do have some control using the main driver sheet, but you don't really have control over block size, when exactly you want to make a request, when exactly you can confirm you received that request was executed successfully. So you have very little control using the main driver sheet. And pretty much using the main driver sheet, you try to pull one different block size, so you can configure here as many tags as you need. And in InduSoft, you break that tags into what we call virtual groups or virtual block groups. And we are going to make a request of each individual virtual group every 600 milliseconds. Again, there is not a lot of control here. Now, a second option you have on any driver is you can right-click and you can go into Modbus TCP and you can say Insert. And we are going to insert what we call a standard driver sheet. So using a standard driver sheet, as you see here, the header has way more options. So the header portion of the sheet here has way more options, such as the read trigger, the enable read and idle, read completed, read status, write trigger, enable write on tag change, write completed, write status, station and header. So the idea of the standard driver sheet is that you're going to have way more control over your communication. So on that example here, you could say, I want to read my variable here, coming out of my, let's say that's a holding register, for example. Let's say 0 and holding register 10, and my station would be 127.0.0.1. Now, if you set either a number 1 here or a tag which is true is equals to 1, and you use this field enable read and idle, InduSoft will try to request this data from this specific PLC at this station as pretty much whenever the driver is done reading all the others virtual groups, if any, it will request a read request here as fast up to 600 milliseconds. Now, if you do not want to read that every 600 milliseconds, you can have a read trigger here. So you can create a tag, and you can call it whatever you want. I'm just calling read trigger. And you say an integer. And then, so because I don't have the device here, but what we can do is actually enable my field read commands here. So you see that every time I make a request, we are going to try to read, but only when I make that request. So if I save that, okay, I come here and I start my driver runtime, okay. Now if I say 0, there it goes. It tried to request. There was a communication error, but it tried to request only a single time. Now, if I come back here and I remove my read trigger, or I can leave it there and not trigger, but I enable my read and idle, we are going to try to keep reading that tag pretty much as fast as we can, as long as there is no other reading group in the queue. So again, anytime you need, the idea is that anytime you need a little bit more control, you need to know exactly when to read. You need to know, okay, I need to request this data. A very common scenario when using standard driver sheets sometimes is you have a process, and whenever you receive a trigger from the process and says, okay, the process is done, you have to go to the PLC, request some variable, some data stored on PLC registers, read that data, and then store the data on the database. So you need to make sure that by the time you are trying to store the data on the database, you have all the reading completed. So in this case, you could have here a read completed flag, tag. I'm going to create as an integer. I'm going to disable the reading for now, when idle, so we can see a little bit more control here. Okay, there it goes. So now if I do a read completed here, and I come here and I execute a read trigger, it tries to read, and as soon as it's done, it failed, and then you could check if it failed or not based on a read status. But as soon as it's done, it toggles for you the read completed. So this way you know, okay, now I have all my data that I need. So if I do 0 again, it tries to read, fails, and sets the read completed to 0, and so on and so forth. Okay. Okay, so let's see. Oh, one very important aspect whenever you're using a standard driver sheet, as you even mentioned on your question there, is that when you're using the main driver sheet, InduSoft will automatically break all the tags that you might have here into what is known as the block size. So every single communication protocol, such as Modbus or any other one available in the market, they have one characteristic which is called the block size, and that pretty much means how much data, how many data can we exchange on a single request. So for Modbus, for example, by default, by design, is 64 words. So you can come here. There are some devices out there that support more than that, so you can increase your max block size. But by default, that's 64. And if you're using the main driver sheet, InduSoft will automatically look for all the tags you have, and when creating that virtual groups, it will automatically break that virtual groups for you. So let me show another example here. So I'm going to disable that one. I'm going to put my variable again. I'm going to say I'm trying to read locally here, which doesn't make any sense, but just for. So let's say that you have my variable on holding register 1, and then the my variable 2. Oops, sorry. Comes out of my holding register 100. So there's a gap of 100 words between these two variables, these two PLC registers. So now when I'm trying to read, it's failing as well. As you see, I'm using the main driver sheet, so it's reading all the time. But now if I come here to my system tray bar, you can come here, and for each driver instance that you have InduSoft running, you have a small icon. So for example, that's the one for the Modbus. You can right-click and you can see virtual read groups. And InduSoft automatically broke these two tags. Although they're coming from the same station, the same PLC, it automatically broke that into two different virtual groups because it knows, okay, those are more than 64 words apart. So it needs to be two separate read requests. Otherwise, as you said, it's going to have a block size issue. Your PLC will respond, okay, I cannot handle that much data at a single request. Now, that's when you're using the main driver sheet. If you're using the standard driver sheet, you need to be careful with the block size. You need to control the block size on your own. So in other words, if here you're saying, I'm starting my request on 4x0, and I do my variable 2 here, and I say 100, and you try to request that, and we were on a real environment with the devices connected, it would fail because InduSoft will try to request these two variables, these two registers at the same request, at the same read request. So really important. Using the standard driver sheet, you do have more control. The idea of the standard driver sheet is exactly that, to have more control, but you need to be careful with the block size. And as I said, each different PLC, each different protocol, in fact, will have a different block size. Okay, let me see if I have any additional questions here on the chat. Okay, I do have another one asking about, I mentioned on the beginning about the find and replace, so the guy wants to understand how that works. So very, very easy, very good question. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to jump back to the PC demo, just because it's a bigger project. It's going to be nicer to see the result of that. But now on InduSoft, on version, once you install Service Pack 1 on your 8.0 installation, it's a free of charge installation if you have a 8.0 license. So you can go to our website and just download Service Pack 1. And now you have this find and replace. And if you click, it will open this interface. And the first time, if you have an existing project, like you have a project that were already developed on version 7.1 or even 8.0, the first time you open the project, it will perform this synchronization. So pretty much it's looking through every single tag, every single file, every single interface on the product, and it is storing not only tags, because before this new feature, many of you probably are familiar with the cross-reference, and that was limited to looking, searching for tags only on files. Now, using the new find and replace, you can find any text you want, not just tags. So pretty much what this synchronization process is doing is looking for every single file and storing that every single text that you have on any file. It could be a label, it could be a logic, it could be a condition that you have on a graphic script, on a button, and it is storing that on the database so that when we request a search, it's way faster. So for those of you familiar with the cross-reference, those of you familiar with big projects, you're probably used on having sometimes a delay when trying to do a cross-reference for a tag. It could take a couple minutes. Now I have this project here. If I search for, let's say, let's put here one tag, so let's do the second tag. Let's see if we have, and I do a find all. In less than a second, now you have every single interface where the second tag was found. And as you see, it includes reports, it includes the scripts, and also gives to you, provides you a hint, okay, it's under task, script 1 on this row, and that's the script you have at that specific row. So you see we found for seconds. Although it wasn't the tag, it found the word second here on a VB variable, and it searched it for us. So again, it's way more powerful than before because now we can search for anything, not just tags. So if I come back again and I say I want to find all my if conditions on my entire project, you can search for that, and again, in less than a second, now I have all the find results here, and as you see here, there's tons of it because it's a very basic scripting function that you use if. So you find every single occurrence of that specific code or that specific tag or that specific word on your project. So very nice feature for those of you dealing with projects, especially big projects. Just got to follow up on the question. So in this case, okay. Main driver sheet Modbus RTU driver almost always to the device the block size is set to 1 and find solution to fix it. Okay, I'm not sure I understood exactly the last comment from this customer, but what I'm going to do here, I'm going to put here on one of the last slides, you have my mail. So if you want to write a specific mail to myself with the exact scenario you are facing there, I'll be glad to follow up with you after the meeting so we can go over your specific scenario that you're facing issues with the communication. Okay, let me see if I have any other last quick ones here. We are running out of time. All the questions I had here on the chat and on the interface. So let me show here my notepad so any of you guys can send questions, or if for some reason I lost any of the questions on the chat interface, feel free to shoot an email to me, and I'll be glad to follow up with you regarding any question you might have. So my email is paulo.guerra@schneiderelectric.com. So again, feel free to send me an email. Once again, I'd like to thank you, all of you guys, for participating today. Really pleasure for working with you guys throughout the year. And we'll be back in 2017 with more webinars, more release for our software, new features, and so on. Okay, wish everybody a happy 2017, happy new year. Talk with you again next year. Bye.